For many years, I carried a quiet prayer in my heart that I never spoke aloud. Every mother has dreams for her child, but mine was never about success, wealth, or applause. I never asked life to make my son famous. I never begged heaven to place crowns upon his head. I only prayed that one day, someone would look into his eyes and see the extraordinary heart he tried so hard to hide from the world. I prayed that someone would love him, not because he was perfect, but because he was beautifully human. Today, as I watch him standing beside the woman who has become his forever love, I realize that some prayers take years to bloom, because they are growing into something far more beautiful than we could ever imagine. When people see my son smiling today, they assume he has always carried light within him. They see confidence, warmth, and kindness. They see a man who knows how to make others feel safe. But they never saw the little boy I tucked into bed, after nights when he asked questions I struggled to answer. They never heard the silence that filled our home after disappointment visited us. They never witnessed the quiet tears he tried to hide, because he believed that being strong meant suffering without witnesses. Even as a child, he loved with all his heart. If a friend was lonely, he would sit beside them until they smiled. If an animal wandered into our yard hungry, he would secretly share his dinner. I remember finding half of his sandwich missing one afternoon. When I asked where it had gone, he simply shrugged and whispered, "Mum, someone else needed it more." That was my son. He gave pieces of himself without ever asking whether there would be enough left for him. Sometimes I worried about that beautiful heart of his. The world is not always gentle with people who love deeply. Kindness often attracts those who mistake it for weakness. Compassion is sometimes answered with selfishness. I wanted to protect him from every heartbreak, but mothers eventually learn a painful truth. We cannot walk every road for our children. We can only pray they remember the lessons we whispered into their hearts when they were too young to understand them. As he grew older, I watched him become a remarkable young man. He respected everyone, regardless of their position. He thanked waiters by name. He opened doors without expecting praise. He listened more than he spoke. There was something incredibly rare about him. He never tried to become the loudest person in the room, because he believed real strength was quiet. I often looked at him and wondered if the world would ever reward a soul like his. Then came the first time he believed he had found love. I still remember the sparkle in his eyes when he introduced her to me. He smiled in a way I hadn't seen since he was a little boy, chasing butterflies in the backyard. Hope had returned to his face. Every conversation somehow found its way back to her. He spoke about the future with excitement instead of fear. As his mother, I wanted nothing more than to see that happiness last forever. But life has a way of teaching lessons we never volunteer to learn. One evening, he came home much earlier than expected. The house was quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I heard the front door close, but there was no cheerful greeting. There were only slow footsteps. When I looked up, I saw my son standing there with eyes that had forgotten how to shine. He tried to smile. He failed. I didn't ask questions immediately. A mother's heart often understands before words arrive. I simply opened my arms. He stepped forward like the little boy he used to be. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, his voice broke. "Mom, sometimes loving someone isn't enough." Those words shattered something inside me because I knew how much courage it had taken for him to say them. I gently held his face in my hands and whispered, "No, my son, sometimes it isn't. But never believe that your ability to love was the mistake." He closed his eyes, trying to keep the tears from falling. I gave everything. I know. I wasn't pretending. I know. I wanted forever. I know. That night, we sat together until sunrise. We didn't search for someone to blame. We didn't speak bitterly about the past. Instead, we talked about something far more important. I told him that love should never make him ashamed of having a soft heart. I reminded him that heartbreak is not proof that someone is unworthy. Sometimes two good people simply cannot build the same future. Pain, as cruel as it feels, is not always punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. For a long time after that, he became quieter. He still smiled. He still helped strangers. He still called me every week just to ask if I had eaten. But there was a cautiousness inside him that hadn't existed before. It was as though he had locked a room inside his heart and hidden the key from everyone, including himself. Watching that change was one of the hardest experiences of my life. Mothers notice the smallest differences. I noticed how he laughed a little less. I noticed how he stared out the window longer than before. I noticed how he always changed the subject whenever someone asked whether he was seeing anyone. One afternoon, while we were drinking tea together, I finally asked him, "Do you still believe love exists?" He smiled gently, but there was sadness behind it. "I believe it exists, Mum." "Then why do you sound uncertain?" He looked down at his cup. "Because I don't know if it exists for me anymore." Those words stayed with me for weeks. That evening, before he left, I stopped him at the front door. "My son." He turned around. I placed my hand on his shoulder the same way I had done when he was a little boy preparing for his first day of school. "Don't let one ending convince you that your whole story has already been written." He looked at me silently. "The woman who is truly meant for you won't ask you to become someone else before she chooses you. She will recognize your heart before she notices anything else. She won't be frightened by your kindness. She'll treasure it." He didn't answer, but I saw hope flicker ever so slightly in his eyes. At that moment, neither of us knew that life, in its quiet and mysterious way, was already preparing to bring someone into his world who would finally understand that the greatest treasure my son possessed was not his smile, his strength, or his success. It was the extraordinary way he loved Dot. The months that followed moved quietly, almost as if life itself was allowing my son time to heal, without demanding that he become someone new. I never believed healing happened all at once. I have always believed it arrives the way morning does, not with a sudden burst of light, but one gentle ray at a time. Some days he smiled more easily. Other days I could still see the weight behind his eyes. Yet even in his sadness, he never stopped being the kind man I had raised. He never allowed his pain to become an excuse for treating others poorly. There is something I have always admired about my son. Heartbreak changed his expectations, but it never changed his character. He still called his grandparents every Sunday. He still carried groceries for elderly neighbors without being asked. He still remembered birthdays that everyone else forgot. Whenever someone needed help moving, repairing something, or simply listening without judgment, they somehow found their way to him. I used to wonder how someone carrying so much pain could still make room for everyone else's burdens. One evening, I asked him exactly that. "My son," I said as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of gold, "don't you ever grow tired of giving?" He smiled softly. "Sometimes." "Then why don't you stop for a while?" He looked toward the horizon before answering. "Because, Mum, I know what it feels like to hope someone will show up." His words settled deep inside my heart. I realized then that suffering had not made him colder. It had made him gentler. He had become the kind of man who noticed invisible battles because he had fought his own. Time continued its quiet work, and little by little, the heaviness I had worried about began to lift. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations or miraculous transformations. Instead, I noticed small things that only a mother would see. He started humming while making breakfast. He laughed at old family stories again. He began talking about dreams instead of disappointments. Hope had not returned all at once. It had quietly unpacked its bags and made itself at home. Then one afternoon my phone rang. "Hi, Mum." The warmth in his voice immediately caught my attention. "You sound happy." There was a brief silence. "I think I met someone." I smiled without realizing it. "Oh?" "I don't know where this will go." "You don't have to know." "I just wanted to tell you." After we ended the call, I stood by the kitchen window for a long time. Not because I believed he had already found the love of his life, but because I heard something far more precious than excitement. I heard courage. After everything he had been through, he had chosen to open his heart again. That alone was a victory. Weeks passed before I met her. I remember being more nervous than she was. Mothers often pretend to be calm, but inside we carry 1,000 silent questions. Will she be kind? Will she understand him? Will she see the gentle soul behind his quiet smile? Will she protect his heart, the way he protects everyone else's? When she walked through my front door, she greeted me with a warm smile that reached her eyes. There was no pretending, no performance, no effort to impress. She simply seemed genuine. As we sat together around the dinner table, I watched them without saying much. Mothers become experts at observing what words cannot explain. I noticed the way she listened when he spoke, instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I noticed how he looked more relaxed than I had seen him in years. I noticed that when he laughed, it came naturally. Most importantly, I noticed peace. Real love has a quietness to it. It doesn't constantly ask to be admired. It doesn't need to prove itself every 5 minutes. It simply allows two people to breathe more easily in each other's presence. After dinner, while my son stepped outside to answer a phone call, she remained in the kitchen helping me wash the dishes. I told her she didn't have to. She smiled. "I know." "Then why are you helping?" "Because this is your home." Her answer touched me more deeply than she probably realized. As we stood side by side, she looked at me with gentle sincerity. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I've never met anyone like your son." My heart skipped a beat. She continued quietly. "He notices little things that everyone else misses. He remembers what I say. He makes me feel heard. I've never had to wonder where I stand with him, because he treats me with honesty every single day." I looked down at the dish in my hands, blinking back tears. Then she said the words every mother longs to hear. "I know someone must have taught him how to love like that." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I wasn't crying because she complimented me. I was crying because she had seen him. Not his appearance, not his accomplishments, his heart. When my son returned, he looked between us with a puzzled smile. "What happened?" I laughed softly and wiped my eyes. "Nothing." She smiled too. "We were just talking." But in that quiet moment, I thanked God with every beat of my heart. Not because my son had found someone beautiful, not because he had found someone intelligent, not because he had found someone who made him happy. I was grateful because he had finally found someone who valued the very qualities the world had once overlooked. As the months turned into a year, I watched their relationship grow in ways that felt almost effortless. They celebrated ordinary days as though they were special occasions. They respected each other's dreams. They apologized when they were wrong. They chose conversations over silence and understanding over pride. One afternoon, I asked him, "What makes this relationship different?" He smiled in that quiet way he always had whenever his heart was full. "I don't feel like I have to earn her love, Mum." Those words stayed with me. So many people spend years believing love is something they must constantly prove they deserve. But the right person doesn't make love feel like a competition. The right person makes love feel like coming home. I realized then that my son had stopped searching for perfection. He had found peace. And sometimes, peace is the greatest form of love we will ever know. One evening, as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, he sat beside me on the old porch where we had shared countless conversations over the years. He looked at me with the same gentle eyes he had as a little boy and quietly said, "Mum, I think I've finally found my forever." I looked at him for a long moment before smiling through tears. Deep inside, I already knew. Because for the first time in many years, the light in his eyes wasn't the fragile excitement of someone hoping love would stay. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found someone who was already planning never to leave. I looked at my son for a long time after he spoke those words. "Mum, I think I've finally found my forever." There was no fear in his voice, no uncertainty, no desperate need for reassurance. It was the calm voice of a man whose heart had finally sentenced searching because it had found a place where it belonged. I reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "You've waited a long time for this." He smiled. "So has she." That answer stayed with me. He wasn't thinking only about his own happiness. Even in one of the most beautiful moments of his life, he was thinking about the woman standing beside him. That was the son I had always known. Love to him had never been about receiving everything. It had always been about building something together. As the days passed, I watched them prepare for their future. They weren't planning a perfect life. They knew that no such life existed. Instead, they were preparing to face imperfect days with perfect commitment. They talked about dreams, but they also talked about responsibilities. They laughed about vacations, but they also discussed difficult seasons that every couple eventually faces. They weren't pretending life would always be easy. They were promising that they would never stop choosing each other when life became difficult. One afternoon, I found an old photo album tucked away in a cabinet. I sat by the window and slowly turned each page. There was my son as a toddler, smiling with chocolate all over his face. Another picture showed him holding my hand on his first day of school, trying to look brave while quietly hiding behind me. There he was, riding his first bicycle, falling, getting back up, and refusing to quit. Every photograph carried a memory, and every memory reminded me how quickly time moves. While I was looking through those pictures, he walked into the room. "What are you doing, Mum?" I smiled and held up the album. "Remember this?" He laughed. "I can't believe you still have all of these." A mother never throws away the chapters of her child's life. He sat beside me, and together we looked through years that seemed to pass in only a few moments. After a while, he became quiet. "I didn't realize how much you've been there for every part of my life." I gently touched his shoulder. "I never needed recognition." "I know. You were always enough." His eyes filled with tears. I wasn't always easy to raise. I couldn't help but smile. No child is. He laughed softly. I made mistakes. So did I. I wish I could go back and change some things. I shook my head. If you erased every mistake, my son, you would also erase the wisdom that came from surviving them. He lowered his eyes. I never wanted to disappoint you. My heart broke hearing those words. You never did. But I failed sometimes. I lifted his chin so he would look at me. Failure never disappointed me. Giving up would have. He wrapped his arms around me, just as he had done years ago after his first heartbreak. Only this time, the tears were different. They weren't born from pain. They were born from gratitude. A few weeks later, he introduced me to a small place they loved visiting together. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't famous. It was just a quiet little cafe where they spent hours talking about life. As I watched them together, I noticed something beautiful. Neither of them was trying to impress the other anymore. They simply enjoyed being together. She laughed at his terrible jokes. He remembered exactly how she liked her coffee. She reached for his hand without thinking. He looked at her with the same respect when she was silent as when she was speaking. Love had become ordinary, and I realized that ordinary love is often the most extraordinary kind. People spend so much of their lives searching for fireworks that they overlook the steady flame capable of warming them through every season. My son had finally found that steady flame. One evening, as we walked beneath a sky filled with stars, he asked me a question I never expected. Mom, were you ever afraid I wouldn't find someone? I smiled honestly. I wasn't afraid you wouldn't find love. He looked surprised. I was afraid someone wouldn't recognize the beautiful heart carrying that love. He stopped walking. Do you really think my heart is beautiful? I laughed through happy tears. My son, since the day you were born. He looked away for a moment. I almost stopped believing that. I know. I'm glad I didn't. So am I. Months later came the day every mother imagines long before it arrives. I watched him standing there, waiting for the woman he loved. He wasn't nervous about the ceremony. He was overwhelmed by gratitude. When she appeared, his eyes filled with tears before she even reached him. There were no dramatic speeches, no perfect movie moments. Just two people looking at each other as though they had finally reached the place they had been walking toward their entire lives. As they exchanged their promises, I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I remembered the little boy who once cried because he thought nobody would choose him. I remembered the young man who came home carrying a broken heart. I remembered every late-night conversation, every prayer, every silent tear, every hopeful sunrise after a difficult night. And suddenly, every painful chapter made sense. Not because pain itself was beautiful, but because my son had refused to let pain define him. He had chosen kindness after disappointment. He had chosen hope after heartbreak. He had chosen forgiveness instead of bitterness. He had chosen to keep loving, even after love had once wounded him. Those choices brought him here. When the ceremony ended, he walked over and hugged me so tightly that for a moment he was my little boy again. He whispered into my ear, "Thank you for never letting me give up on love." I closed my eyes. No, my son. I smiled through tears that refused to stop falling. Thank you for proving that a gentle heart can survive a hard world without becoming hard itself. As I watched him walk away, hand in hand with the woman who had become his forever love, I realized something every parent eventually learns. Our children do not belong to us forever. We are simply trusted to guide them until they are ready to build a life of their own. And if we have loved them well, if we have taught them kindness instead of pride, compassion instead of judgment, faith instead of fear, then one day they will carry those lessons into another family, another home, another generation. That is how love continues long after we are gone. If anyone asks me today what my greatest achievement has been, I will never speak about sacrifices, sleepless nights, or the hardships of raising a child. I will simply smile and say this: I raised a son who never allowed this world to steal the goodness from his heart. I raised a man who discovered that forever love is not found by chasing perfection, but by becoming someone who chooses love with honesty, patience, humility, and unwavering loyalty every single day. And now, when I see him standing beside the woman who loves him for exactly who he is, I no longer whisper the prayer I carried for so many years. That prayer has already been answered. My son finally found his forever love. And in watching him love and be loved so completely, I found a quiet peace of my own. Because a mother's heart is never richer than the moment she realizes that the little boy she once held in her arms has grown into a man whose heart has become someone else's safest place. That is a love story I will cherish for the rest of my life. And when my own journey on this earth is finally over, I will leave with the deepest comfort a mother could ever know: that my son is no longer walking through life alone. He is walking beside the love of his life, hand in hand, heart to heart, and soul beside soul. Toward a forever they will write together, one beautiful day at a time.